checking the attendees list. There's no one. Oh yeah, got someone coming on there. I can see a few people joining, so we'll just give it a minute or two, just to let everybody who's planning to attend. Okay. The attendee numbers seem to have stabilised. So look, I just say hi, my name's Anthony Manahan. I'm from the University of Melbourne in Melbourne, Australia, and so I'm facilitating today's discussion. So I'd like to, welcome you to the 5th in the series of the Groningen Declaration Network virtual annual meeting series of webinars, which is around lifelong learning and examples and collaboration and innovation. I think to begin with, I'd like to go to the next slide and just play a short video from the current president of the GDN, Kathleen Massey.
Hello, my name is Kathleen Massey, and I'm the new president of the Groningen Declaration Network, and I'd like to welcome you to the GDN's new webinar series. I'm so pleased that you have decided to participate in the GDN by attending today's webinar. Your involvement is critical to the success of the network. The GDN is a global organization that brings together people and organizations who are committed to making it possible and easy for people worldwide to consult and share their authentic educational data with whomever they want, whenever they want, wherever they are. Today, you are joining thought leaders from across the world to pave the way for this to be done well, equitably, and by developing trusted networks and using contemporary secure technology. I invite you to continue your involvement in the GDN by attending additional webinars and by joining us at our next annual meeting in Ottawa, Canada in May 2021. I hope you find this live webinar both informative and engaging, and I thank you again for joining us today.
Well, in the spirit of the digital world, I'd like to say thank you to the digital Kathleen for that great overview and introduction. I think today's session, again, so I'd like to welcome you today or this evening or this afternoon, depending on where you are, webinar on lifelong learning, collaboration and innovation, and some different takes on this, including pathways to international learners, micro-credentials, and the work in Australia towards a national credential platform. Given we're a fairly intimate group, I'm hoping this can be a discussion. However, each panelist is going to speak on their topic that all contribute to lifelong learning and are examples of collaboration and innovation. I'm also hoping to use this for a small push, talking about some of the challenges and opportunities, to establish an Oceania chapter of the Groningen Declaration Network as a lens to some of the discussion, but we'll see how we go on that front, because I realise that that everybody is from a range of backgrounds, and that may not be quite so relevant for today. So I'd like to really begin by introducing the panel. The first speaker is going to be Rob Thomason, who's the CEO of VetAssess, and Rob's going to speak to us about the pathways of international learners. Then we're going to have Joanna Brown, who's the Director of Academic Services at the University of Auckland from New Zealand on micro-credentials and digital badging, and Jay Segath, who's the My Equals Program Director at Higher Ed Services, and he's going to sort of discuss the move to a national credentials platform and some of the work that's been happening around that. So as I said, each panelist will speak, and then we'll have time for questions and discussion afterwards. And because we are a small group, you will all have been enabled, you'll all have had your video and audio enabled by that point. So I'm hoping everybody can switch on their video, switch on their audio after Jay's presentation, which is the third one, so that we can have a discussion and you can ask questions directly. However, if you've got any burning questions as we go, please use the chat function, and I'm happy to to read that out. So I think without further ado on that front, I think I'd like to invite Rob to open proceedings on the pathways of international learners. Thanks, Rob.
Good, thank you, Anthony, and welcome everybody to this webinar series. I'd like to pay my respects to Aboriginal elders, past, present and future, on whose various lands we're holding this meeting. I'm Rob Thompson, CEO at VETASSESS. Our organisation's Australia's leading provider of skills assessment services for migration and employment purposes in Australia. And a growing part of our work is assessing alternative qualifications provided by a range of different educational entities throughout our region and globally. We believe a digital ecosystem that promotes these different qualifications and other ends on a global scale is really important. It's something which is dear to my heart and something that I've supported through my work over many years. And that's the global mobility of learners across our globe. This is going to be particularly important in our post-COVID world. A lot of this is unknown, as we all know. That's where we sit at the moment, but there will be significant pressures towards the end of this year into next year to reintroduce global mobility as we knew it in 2019 and the early part of 2020. It's my pleasure to be invited on to this webinar series. We're disappointed we couldn't get to India for the Groningen Declaration Conference, but look forward to being in Canada next year for the annual general meeting of the Groningen Declaration. So I'm starting this presentation looking at the number of international learners in Australia. We're third, Australia, as a market in total numbers of international learners in our country. Looking at those international learners and where they move, how they move, and looking at two case studies which highlight some of the challenges involved in global mobility. And then I'll talk about what we see as being a really important part of a global digital ecosystem. So first off, I'd like to talk about the number of international students. We have a significant number, as I said, in Australia. The US, and I think we've got some people from the US involved in the webinar, is in terms of absolute numbers, is number one, accounting for nearly 20% of international students globally. The United Kingdom comes in at second place, but Australia is a very close third. So for size and scale of education in Australia, we really do punch above our weight. I think a prediction is that if Australia, Canada and New Zealand continue to manage the pandemic well, we might see a rebalancing over the next few years in terms of international global mobility of students. And we might be speaking in a few years' time with Australia having a significantly larger number of international students in our universities and vocational education and secondary education. For those who decide to stay in Australia, there's a number of different pathways once students have finished their courses, but it's not a linear pathway. We find there's an extraordinary variance in ways that people either decide to stay in Australia or seek to use their qualifications in moving to other parts of the globe, whether that's going back home to our major source countries. Our major source countries in Australia are China and India, and a significant number of students do actually go back to their source countries. A linear pathway, if you think about it, would be a student comes into Australia on a student visa while they study. They would then progress to a temporary graduate visa on completion of their studies and have post-year work rights of either up 2 to 4 years, depending on their location and depending on their degree. And then during their period of temporary stay, they would seek permanent residency or seek to go back to their home country. But what we find is there is significant variance in that pathway, so it's not a linear process. And we find when we look at the number of the different sorts of visas which students take up after they've graduated, we see a significant variance there. More than 2/5, 41% of students do actually permanently migrate. So that's probably lower than a lot of people think, particularly the media in Australia. The number who go back home after studying in Australia is a significant number. So it's nearly 60% of our students go back to their source country. And many, 35%, actually continue on to do some study while they're here. Others look to temporary short stay visas, getting some some work experience, so when they go back to their home country, they've got that experience. And this, I guess, shows that there is the variance in the way that people take up their opportunities. Those that do stay, many do keep studying, as I said. We don't see, again, a linear pathway. You might think that a student might go from an English language called ALICOS. Those who are not used to the Australian language, the English language intensive courses for overseas students. As in education, we love acronyms. ALICOS to vocational education and training, vocational education and training to higher education. You see there, interestingly, a number go from higher education into vocational education and training. It's interesting to note that again, reinforces that point that there's no one particular pathway, and globally mobile students have to have access to a range of their qualifications so that they can show those to prospective employers or prospective institutions in terms of the way that they want to use their qualification. So that gives you very quick, there's a lot of data that I've covered in those first few slides, but that gives you a bit of an overview of the complexity that students face when they're coming into Australia to study, and I'm sure it's similar in other countries in making choices around how they want to use their qualification. We, in part of our work, is trying to understand the motivators of students who are seeking to permanently migrate to Australia. We've done a number of case studies, and I'll just focus on two for the purposes of this presentation. So we have two people who are now permanent residents in Australia, so they've got permanent residency, both coming out of India, so Apurva and Nakul. Apurva had completed the diploma of interior design and architecture in India, and came to Australia to further her studies as in architecture by doing a Masters of Architecture. While studying in Australia, she applied for a number of roles and only had one interview, and she was unsuccessful in that job. So despite a bachelor's degree and diploma from India that weren't recognised by employers, they were recognised qualifications as far as the Australian government's concerned, but they weren't recognised by employers. She ended up working in hospitality during her master's degree. That was 3 years ago. And once she completed her master's in landscape architectural landscape design, she was snapped up very quickly, and is now, in the last 2 years, has been working as a landscape architect. She'd originally intended to apply for permanent residency using her bachelor's degree from India, but given that she got work as a landscape architect, she used that qualification to seek permanent residency and has been successful in doing that. Interesting story with Nakul. Nakul was transferred internally from Deloitte in India to a role here in Australia. And while his qualifications in accounting provided the threshold requirement, it was his other credentials that signalled his currency and his suitability to broader roles here in Australia. He's done a lot of micro-credentials, a lot of internal training within Deloitte, and it was really these certification as an ANA planner and his project management and test management that gave him the opportunity to continue working here in Australia. He applied with employer sponsorship for permanent residency. He is now a permanent resident here in Australia. You can see there very different routes and very different approaches taken by just two case studies, but what we found as we looked at more and more migrants and their motivations and their pathways, they were all very, very different. And I guess that's what brings us to a view around what a global digital ecosystem really should look like. And I know that Jay will talk a little bit about this in his presentation around eWorks. But the systems need to be informative. So it's not merely the details of their credentials, but what is important. And it needs to be permanent so that employers, students, and tertiary institutions can access that material. It needs to take out the middleman. we know that in migration, particularly as a solid trade in migration agents, in vet assessors' experience, about 40% of our applicants don't use a migration agent. If there was a greater global digital ecosystem, we believe that would dismediate the agencies over a period of time. It needs to store and recognise the credentials, both big traditional qualifications and smaller micro-credentials, and that's what we mean by granularity. And we need to verify their authenticity. And we also need to facilitate comparability. They're all pretty easy to define, pretty easy to talk about, I think pretty easy to actually agree with. What's harder is actually what sits behind that in terms of the intellect of the system, and that's the challenge that we have in developing a digital ecosystem. So when we spoke to our two case studies, Nicole, for example, observed that there are a lot of credentials and qualifications available across the globe, yet there's no means to assess their relative value. He argued for a common yardstick and minimum thresholds around those, and that could be facilitated by such a digital ecosystem. If there was a common yardstick, a PERVA would have had means to provide prospective employers confidence that a Bachelor of Architecture from India is equivalent to a similar qualification offered by Australia's universities. And she would have had greater confidence to include that in her application to migrate permanently. So in closing, I'd just like to show a slide that I spoke about this at last year's Groningen Declaration, and this is a move from traditional qualifications to stacking and a whole range of new qualifications that are emerging. And I've got to say that we've seen significant growth in the last 4 months during the COVID-19 pandemic here in Australia in shorter, sharper programs which are enabling displaced workers to move very quickly into other areas of work. And I think that's going to be the future of qualifications. We're not going to get rid of bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, doctorates, but there will be a whole range of micro-credentials, stackable programs, and they are going to make the real difference going in the future. So within that digital ecosystem, we've actually got to take account that actually both worlds do exist, and that qualifications will coexist with each other across national boundaries. And traditional qualifications will be unbundled and made into more bite-sized offerings. Shorter form credentials will be accumulated by individuals and stacked to form clusters of complementary skill sets. So it means, as I said, that any global digital ecosystem, it's got to support the journey of learners and to facilitate the recognition of their credentials broadly defined by migration assessors, education providers and employers. So we'll hold off questions. I know that there might be some questions, but we'll now hand across to Joanna, who's going to talk a little bit more about micro-credentials, and we can happy to take some questions and have some discussion after Jay has spoken. So thank you, Joanna.
Thanks, Rob. While Joanna's getting that up, that was a lovely segue, I think, into the micro-credentialing. Joanna, I think you're muted.
Thank you. It's always a trick, isn't it, with a new digital world. So
the
kia ora
most common
koutou.
phrase, I think, is such and such.
Absolutely. So kia ora koutou and greetings from Aotearoa, New Zealand, from the University of Auckland. I found Rob's presentation really interesting because I think it highlights the challenges from certainly the student perspective. And what I wanted to talk a little bit about here are those challenges, but also the challenges from an institutional perspective, and actually taking advantage of digital disruption and how this has impacted us all as a consequence of COVID-19. To use my skills with the mouse, the presentation isn't quite coming up in the way I'd anticipated. So what Rob said earlier about possibly Canada, Australia and New Zealand being able to maintain international student numbers in the future is something that we've been thinking about over the last few months. And because New Zealand is currently in a position where we're operating as normal, we have no limitations in terms of our day-to-day activity. It's as it was in the pre-COVID world, apart from the fact our borders are closed, which means that our international students cannot get here. It's having significant implications for us from all levels right through to our doctoral programs. And so as we all did and moved rapidly to a remote form of delivery for those students, we've learned a lot in that journey. And many of our academic staff have said that they've actually moved forward, not just 5 years, as some of the literature is saying, in terms of our digital capability, but leaping here 10, even 15 years in terms of our strategic plans for the future and how we were going to move to a more digital mode of working with our students. Our challenge is now, what are we going to do for the future? And what are we going to embrace as part of that? So in the impacts in terms of travel, economy, health, one of the key outcomes that we're seeing, of course, is employability. We're still obviously well in the midst of that, not understanding how it's going to impact our local economies as well as the global economies. But as Rob said, what we're seeing is increasing demand for our digital offerings. And that is a particular challenge for our university in wanting to ramp up very quickly in order to embrace that. But dealing with the challenges of how we do it, how can we do it quickly, how can we still produce a quality product, because that's important to the reputation of the university, but how will it then be valued both from a student perspective, but also from a third-party employer perspective as well, and trusted. And I think that's one of the key elements that we need to work through as a sector, trust around these new forms of offerings in terms of outcome, both for students and employer, shall we say, in this particular instance. So I've put down there stackability, snackability, and portability and affordability. What I mean by, I'm sure we all know what we mean about stackability, that that we've been talking about for a long time, that we can pathway, that we can stack qualifications up through what might be short courses to micro-credentials to degree level, more formal modes of study. We're certainly on that journey ourselves and moving forward. But the consequences of COVID-19, what we're seeing is more and more students wanting the ability to snack. And what I mean by that is to be able to engage in shorter form type courses or programs, to be able to give them the maximum ability to move in and through the employment market as opportunities arise. And given the impacts that we're all experiencing at the moment, we're seeing increasing demand for that. And our university won't be alone in that. That's a challenge to think about that and deliver on that in the context of our normal product development and delivery. And our products have been designed around formal study, on-campus study, largely from undergraduate through to varying lengths of time in terms of commitment for postgraduate study. So that's some of the things that we're trying to work through currently. And Rob talked a little bit earlier about micro-credentials. That's one of the products that we're seeing gaining huge traction for us within the university, as well as our online delivery. So just to give you a little bit of context in terms of the New Zealand environment, micro-credentials are relatively new in terms of how long they've been recognised by NZQA, that's the New Zealand Qualification Authority, who is the arbiter of all things academic within New Zealand. So I'm just going to put there some of the key things of do's and don'ts and what must be that NZQA have established for us. So it's not a course, it must be standalone. They are credit bearing, they have to be specific in terms of skills and knowledge, and they must have demonstrable support. from the wider community. And as we work through that, we think these are critical elements in terms of building those credibility values that I talked about earlier, around the value of the qualification, how it's seen in the marketplace, how it's valued by students, because it leads to positive outcomes for them, and how it's valued by other institutions or third parties such as employers as well. So that's a journey for us as a country that we've embarked on. I know in some overseas sectors you're probably far more advanced than us. I know some of the Australian universities have probably got quite comprehensive suites of micro-credentials that they're offering. But COVID has helped us to focus our attention on this. And that's for all of the tragedy and crises that COVID has brought to the world. One of the things that, from a positive perspective, is it's forcing us to act far more rapidly in terms of grasping opportunities such as these and moving them forward in a way with resourcing that we would not have had previously within our institutions, and I know within other New Zealand institutions as well. Just a little bit, and this is really just to set the context, I think, around the reasons why it's important about demand, that it's meeting a demand, that I talked previously about filling explicit skills gaps. But the other key thing is aligning to the strategies of the university, both in terms of direction and experience for our students, but also for the wider community within New Zealand. What's it going to add to our global economy, to our New Zealand economy? The University of Auckland certainly positions its place as a thought leader within our own national community. But one of the key aspects for us is part of our business recovery, part of our financial recovery, and every institution across the world is looking at it from the points of survival to what's it going to mean in terms of the impacts of COVID and the size and shape of universities in the future. So this is a direction of travel for us that has become far more important in the last 4 months than we had envisaged it being. It was always part of our strategy, but now it's core to our recovery within the university. These kind of strategies around bite-sized, online, stackable, valued, trusted credentials that are going to support students in their own journey, but are valued in the wider community as well. This is kind of a bit of a way for me to segue into what Jay, I think, is also going to talk about in the wider landscape. And it's, as we're thinking about these kind of qualifications, what does it mean in recognising the qualifications in future? And we've all talked about badging and backpacking and all those kind of things for years. But I can say that all we've done is thought about it and talked about it for quite a long period of time, and now we're actually acting on it. So as we're driving forward in terms of this new landscape, what we need to offer for our students, they need to be able to carry that with them in a way that's accessible and meaningful for them, and we put up there in a modern way. And what that means is digitally, easily accessible, but well understood. And I think that's one of the keys as well. That goes back to, I think one of the key messages that I'm wanting to give is, as we're moving in this direction, it has to be trusted and it has to be valued. And so the work that we've been doing with and Digitally, I think has taken us on that journey over the last few years in terms of portability of qualifications, micro-credentials and badging, and all of those kind of things is going to push us further down that road, but far more quickly than we anticipated. And with the tragedy of what it's brought us here, we can't let these opportunities go, and so we're grasping it absolutely and prioritising it in terms of our own recovery program within the University of Auckland. And I know it's being talked about very widely across both the Australian and New Zealand sectors. So I'll just finish there and hand over to Jay now.
Thanks, Joanna. That was great, and I think that works. You know, that was a nice, again, segue from that. You know, the pathway for learners, and then the actual qualifications and the importance of the qualifications on that pathway. I think, which is a great segue here to then how can we sort of potentially store those qualifications at a broader level. So thanks, Jay.
Thanks, Joanna. Thanks, Anthony. I'd like to give a little bit of a recap of what MyEquals is for those that are not familiar, and how we've progressed since the last update to the GDN community last year in Mexico. Seems like decades ago. And then talk a little bit about the move towards online or lifelong learning and the building of a lifelong learning ecosystem and the various activities that are going on in Australia in particular in relation to that. If I could work there we go. So in terms of a recap, MyEquals was really the response of the Australian and New Zealand higher education sector to the Groningen Declaration, resulting in the establishment of the MyEquals platform, which really was built to allow the providers, the universities, to issue transcripts, testaments, and AHECs, the Australian Higher Education Graduation Certificate, to the learners, and for the learners to share those with third parties, be it employers or for further study, sort of anytime, anywhere, and allowing those third parties to view and verify those documents instantly. The success of MyEquals is really, I guess, encapsulated in the whole of sector collaboration that has achieved. So we've got the 47 Australian and New Zealand universities, which really covers more than 90% of the higher education cohort in the region. The one thing that I think is the major achievement is really the recognition of the participants that collaboration on something where they don't necessarily compete can deliver great outcomes for the sector as a whole and the individual institutions. What we recently, or what Digitree recently made available, and is a badges feature. So in recognition of that move towards micro-credentials, the universities are now able to issue badges associated with those micro-credentials, also through the MyEquals platform, which obviously provides a benefit to the learner as well, in that it starts to create that repository of, all credentials, big and small, in a single place, in a single learner portal. And then finally, we've started to roll out to new participants. So we're expanding beyond the universities that were the founders, if you like, of MyEquals, to non-university higher education providers. And we recently signed up or enabled Canberra Institute of Technology as the first non-university new participant. In terms of sort of adoption of the service and the platform, it's been quite remarkable, given that we really sort of implemented during the course of 2017-18. University of Auckland was the first university that went live, but the majority of the institutions really only started to issue digital credentials through MyEquals in late 2018. So in sort of the year and a half since, we now have more than 1 million learner accounts. So learners, users registered and actively sort of accessing and sharing their records. 3.5 million documents issued and quickly expanding on that. The sharing of those records is very much become a standard practice for learners as they seek further education or employment opportunities. And also the fraud sort of objective has also been met in that we have had nil reports of document tampering. We undertook a survey mid last year where 85% of those learners indicated that they were very satisfied with the platform. So this is really, I guess, a testimony of the collaboration of the universities around My Equals, and you know, great to see the investment actually paying off in terms of that adoption and satisfaction. So that's where we are today, but we started to think about what's next sometime during the course of 2019. Not really in response, but there's been, and there continues to be, a recognition externally that we're moving towards a future of lifelong learning, and that there is a need for a range of effectively an ecosystem to be built, to be put in place, and to provide learners with what has been labeled by sort of different bodies as a lifelong skills account or a lifelong learning account, where those learners can access all their credentials in one place and to use that through their lifelong learning journey. So some parties that sort of express the need for that is the federal government, and I'll talk a little bit further about that in a minute. The Business Council of Australia, which is really the peak body of you know, big business in particular, and the Monash Commission, which is really a think tank, as well as Beverly Oliver, who was previously a DVC academic at Deakin. She's a bit of a guru where micro-credentials and lifelong learning is concerned. So there's been quite a swell of recognition and interest in a lifelong learning platform of sorts. At the same time, we started to work on our vision for My Equals. So how can we build on the achievements today and the collaboration model that we achieved to really provide greater value to learners and other stakeholders in that broader ecosystem. So we articulated that as a vision for My Equals for it to become the record of learning for life. Basically the source of all trusted and verified credentials for all learners in that single place. It will obviously provide benefits to the learners in terms of accessing those qualifications through their lifelong learning journey. It will provide benefits to third parties in that it will allow the connection of talent that comes from education into employment opportunities that exist out there in the marketplace. And it will also allow the universities or the participants in My Equals or the qualification providers to establish that lifelong learning relationship with those learners. There's a number of enablers that sit underneath that. So obviously for this all to work, there needs to be trust and recognition of the platform and the repository, if you like. And My Equals has very much achieved that to a great extent already. There is really a lot of work required that is still pending to agree standards and frameworks. So whilst, for example, everybody talks about micro-credentials, in Australia in particular, we're probably not as far as New Zealand in that we haven't really got anything that sort of defines or provides sort of reference for what a micro-credential is, if they attract credit, how that credit can be treated for transfer purposes and the like. The links to international notes, which is really what Rob was talking about, like there are these types of initiatives globally, and obviously one of the objectives would be to connect all these nodes to enable that international portability of those credentials. There's been a lot going on in the last few months, really, I guess, in response to COVID in a way, in that the government has really initiated a range of programs and initiatives that can really sort of all be tracked to sort of achieving employment outcomes for learners, ensuring that learners undertake the relevant education that responds to the employment needs that exist in the marketplace, and so forth. So this is a bit of a mud map of the different initiatives that are going on there. And I'll talk about the National Credentials Platform in a minute, because that is one of the initiatives that is looking to build on the achievements of My Equals, to build that national credentials repository or platform for Australian learners, and has, in collaboration with the admission centres, with UAC as the lead admission centre, as well as Universities Australia, have been engaged by the government to deliver that national credentials platform. Some other things that are going on, there's a lot of talk about the micro-credentials marketplace that the government has announced. Details to be provided, but in essence, it is meant to be a portal or place where learners can go to find out what the micro-credentials offerings are that may be relevant to them, and to, I guess, apply for them. There's some other initiatives going on in those other bubbles. So the Sure review is about pathways for senior secondary school leavers and learners into the tertiary system. There's the Jobs and Education Data Infrastructure, or JEDI as it is called, which is to develop a skills classification relating to professions and job categories in Australia, and various other activities. So the AQF review is one that is well known to many here. That also seems to establish some reference to recognition of micro-credentials as another qualification that is quickly emerging, as Rob and Joanna pointed out. So all this is very encouraging in terms of various activity that needs to be undertaken, and probably in some instances is a little bit overdue, to create that ecosystem that will enable and facilitate lifelong learning in Australia. So finally, talking about the National Credentials Platform. So off the back of My Equals, really, and recognition that the sector can be trusted to create valuable national assets and platforms, the federal government has awarded a grant to the sector to deliver this National Credentials Platform, which is one of those cornerstone activities of that broader ecosystem work. So the parties involved in that are Universities Australia, and from a delivery point of view, Higher Ed Services as effectively the custodians of My Equals, and also the admission centres led by UAC. So we are engaged and will soon commence the development of the National Credentials Platform. We will need to engage with lots of stakeholders, and we started to map those. And I think Rob's overview basically indicated, for example, VEDASES will be one of those critical stakeholders to consult in this process. Employers would be, education providers will be, the learners themselves, professional associations, and so forth. So there's a lot of work to be done there. We'll be reaching out to all the stakeholder groups to participate in this development of the National Credentials Platform. So in closing, I think this is a great testimony of the work that was started through a small group of registrars within universities to invest in and establish My Equals. And all going well, this provides a pathway to an ecosystem and an environment that will allow lifelong learning and the recognition of those increasing array of different credentials to be managed in a single place, to the benefit of learners and employers.
Right. Well, thanks very much, Jay. That was great. So I think, Jay, could you stop sharing for the minute, bring up the gallery view. And I think everybody, if you can remember, if anybody has any questions, please bring up your video, please switch off, remember to unmute yourself. So I'm going to open it up for questions and discussion. So whilst you're all collecting your thoughts, I think I might open with one. I think what the theme that emerged across all, of course, was that interconnectedness of things. So whether it be, formal versus informal study, employees, other sectors, and then the need for interoperability about how these things are supported. But I think one of our challenges that strikes me is that particularly in formal education, it's very linear. Whereas the new world, if you like, is much less so. It's far more organic, where you can grab, you can snack. I love the snackability sort of idea. I'm just wondering, to the panel, I mean, what do you think is our biggest challenge going forward, particularly in formal education, which is currently very linear? Do you think there's an appetite to actually take a slightly different approach to that, so that we can have a much more organic approach?
Shall I start? I think one of the biggest challenge, and Rob mentioned this, was how we recognise qualifications from other institutions and other jurisdictions. And some of that is based on valid data in terms of outcomes for learners as they've transitioned from institution to institution. But some of it is also based on academic prejudice, shall we say, and sometimes I think we need to get out of our way in order to be able to actually make those big leaps forward. I mean, this is the time for those big breakthroughs to come through, and if we don't deal with all of the issues around recognition of learning as part of this, then it's going to limit opportunities for individuals, particularly as we move to more digital delivery of our products, essentially. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's it's going to be one of the challenges for universities, and having been around universities for a long time, I agree, Joanna, that the prejudices of universities about the rankings, and where you sit on the rankings, and what respect or credit you will give for a particular qualification is going to be a huge hurdle for universities to overcome. But that's not to say we shouldn't try to challenge that system. I was interested, Joanna, and I know we've got a number of people from universities here, that you talked about micro-credentials as reflecting the needs of the university before the needs of industry and learners. So I think that's also going to be a challenge. Micro-credentials give us a real opportunity to react to what industry needs and what learners need. And that's what we've seen over the last 3 months, is really creating micro-credentials that either give an introduction to a particular vocation or give an introduction to a particular qualification, which lets people, as you said, have a try before you buy, if you like, Joanne. So I think there is some real opportunities that the current crisis we're in has provided us to provide a stimulus or a catalyst within our institutions to drive a real change.
I think just to add to that whole, that's tipping it on its head in terms of the way we kind of design, and I'm going to use the word products in this space, design our products for the future, is filling that skills gap, filling that need, being responsive in the marketplace, being responsive in terms of industries, organisations, community groups, iwi within New Zealand, which are our Māori tribes. All of that is going to be a very different way in which we've engaged in developing these things, and then looking at the success of what we offer for our learners in the future. Mm-hmm.
I would just say, I think that's an excellent point too, in terms of just going back to that idea of a local chapter of Groningen, for example, and we need to be able to be speaking a sort of a common, and how can we engage with groups who don't sort of look like us or don't operate in a way that we're familiar with. And I thought, I'm just interested in your thoughts on, and Rob, I think, I'm guessing you probably used the word intentionally, but you referred to comparability, because we often, particularly about that recognition, because we often talk about equivalency. I know in university we're always talking about equivalencies, and we tend to want to take a very algorithmic approach to these things, whereas I personally like the concept of comparability, where it doesn't have to be an exact match. We're taking a more holistic view. And I'm just thinking, I'm guessing that was intentional on your part, the use of comparability?
Yeah, it's a term that excites the juices in a lot of academic departments across universities, because they might concede an equivalence, but they won't concede a comparability, particularly when recognising what a learner has done. And then that transfers obviously into the employment marketplace as well. So different organisations will make determinations on an individual's skills based on the university they attended rather than the comparability of their program. So I lay that as a challenge. I don't particularly have an answer, Jay, how you try to address comparability in a digital ecosystem. It's more educative, I think, back out into the employment marketplace particularly.
Yeah, so I actually was interested sort of listening to your case studies and your, the second case study, which was somebody who came with a backpack of micro-credentials, so to speak. So effectively, VetAssess is like a consumer of micro-credentials, and I'm interested to understand, I guess, what you need, in a micro-credential for it to be accessible from your perspective, because my engagement with the universities now and the adoption of badges that are enabled through my equals is that everyone sort of runs their own race to define themselves what the micro credentials are that they're offering, and I guess guessing how relevant they would be from a receiver, from an employer or an assessor perspective. So I guess my question is, like, what do you need, and how do we connect the definition of these micro-credentials and I guess the frameworks around it in a way that is relevant to those that consume them as an employer or an assessor?
Yeah, from our perspective, it comes back to occupational standards, which are often determined in a professional sense by those professional occupations, whether they'll accept a micro-credential. So we have a base set of occupational standards that we do assessments against. So that's one part of the puzzle, if you like. It's then seeing whether the various government departments that sign off on those would prepare to accept a micro-credential and stackable award. So none of these things are not interrelated. You're right that there's a significant number of interrelationships that need to be addressed to come up with a response to the question. In some ways, again, if you look at that second case study we talked about, it was the backpack of micro-credentials that got him promotions within the professional services firm he was working for, that assisted him getting the employer-sponsored migration permanency. So it was an employer making the call about how much value add there was on the micro-credentials beyond his initial certification. So he was a chartered accountant, so qualification of accounting is accepted within Australia for the purpose of permanency. It's what the employer saw the value in the micro-credentials that added that value in that case.
So I'm just wondering, any participants, does anybody have any questions for the panelists, or any, a statement for discussion, anything anybody would like to raise? I'm going to take that then as a no. I think one of the interesting points that I think everybody alluded to, is some of the opportunity that amongst the terrible time, the opportunity that COVID has presented around a new way of thinking. We've all talked about mobility, but I'd be interested in the panel's view on how do you see mobility in a post and probably in a travel restricted world? What do you think that looks like? What do you think that might look like?
Challenging again. My passport's getting moldy, so it's going to be really interesting, Joanna, with you know what's happened in New Zealand, and I think you're still virus free in New Zealand. You know, when are your borders going to open? In Australia, we're a federation. Those who don't know Australia particularly well, I think most on the panel, or most of the participants do. We have various levels of border closure, even within Australia. Which I think is going to make travel pretty difficult for the next period of time. In terms of the Australian government's Treasury estimates, is that skilled migration will be probably 30% down over the next 12 months from what it was in the previous 12 months. That's going to have an impact on Australia's economy. So there are economic reasons why countries will be forced to open borders more quickly than they might otherwise want to do. And then it's quarantine regimes and how they will impact as well.
I think it's a question that we're all grappling with, and it's going to take quite a while to work through. So as we're continuing to support quite a number of our international students through remote delivery, we can see that it's all on the basis that they're hoping beyond hope that our borders will open, and they're going to be able to get there here within the next few months to have that on-campus, you know, in-country experience. That is part of the reason that they signed up in the first place to come here. So it's thinking about, as we're continuing with a remote delivery, what's the value add? What is the reason why a student would choose a particular whatever it might be, micro-credential program within an institution compared to another institution? And I think it's that value add, I think it's the pathway, I think it's around affordability, where the students place, and where, you know, all of those issues around pathway and qualification, stacking qualifications, I think will become more and more to the fore. But it will come down to choice for, you know, if our borders remain closed and limited in the way they are currently, it will be around that value add as to why students will select to apply for particular courses or programs over others in particular sectors, whether that be university or other types of institutions. And it will be around all of those issues around where is it going to take me, what are the outcomes I'm going to be, you know, what will be the reputation of this qualification for me internationally.
I'm wondering.
I think there's a, sorry, Karen.
Oh, I was just going to say, in terms of portability of global portability of your credentials once you've achieved them, I'm wondering, with the advent of how well working from home has worked for organisations, whether that won't be nearly as affected as we might think, because employers will still need to see verified credentials, and in terms of the portability of working overseas or working globally, I think there may even be some, you know, opportunities there, because it's been proven for so many organisations that working from home can work, and so they could employ someone in Australia or in America. So I think the mobility, you know, the ability to share your credentials with employers around the world won't be nearly as affected as we might have thought.
Yeah, I second that. Like I mean, there's a silver lining, right? Like give it a year or whatever, and COVID will be a distant memory. And I think some things that are evident from our perspective is, you know, there's a lot of new providers that are recognizing the benefits of digital credentials simply because they can't service the hard copy sort of issuing requirement. You know, the government is funding short course credentials that I think are another push for the adoption of, you know, alternative credential types other than the traditional ones. So, and you're right, like student mobility is with online learning no longer necessarily sort of tied to having to travel to the other side of the world to study there. So I think all those things actually have provided a bit of a boost to the objectives of what we're trying to achieve. We just got to sort of get through this this nasty period, in my view.
Cool. Well,
can I ask a question?
Cool.
So Joanna asked, Joanna mentioned that New Zealand has micro-credentials recognised within their qualification framework. Jay noted that Australia hasn't gone that far and there isn't a shared definition around what a micro-credential is. And you asked a question of Rob about what does he need. I'll be interested. What does my equals need as they move more and more into the digital badges? What do they need to facilitate snackability and stackability and the portability of micro-credentials?
Yeah, so I mean, ultimately, my equals is essentially, the repository where these credentials are held with, I guess, the associated whatever data recognition in terms of credits and what have you. So the definition of those standards, credits, etc., really needs to sit elsewhere. So it's, as you may know, like there was an AQF review undertaken last year. It does recognize that there needs to be more sort of codification of micro-credentials. There is a working group within or guided by the department to implement the AQF review recommendations. And I think we probably will follow suit in terms of what New Zealand has done in at least providing some ground rules as to what micro-credentials are and need to be. So yeah, there's a lot there that sits outside simply what my equals is, but the value of my equals will obviously grow when those standards and frameworks are adopted and agreed. So there's a lot of work to be done in Australia and in New Zealand, probably to a lesser degree.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any questions? We've just gone over the hour. So look, on that note, I would just like to say, well, thank you for everybody for participating, and in particular, thank you to our panelists, to Rob, to Joanna, and Jay. I thought it was really interesting and some really helpful insights, and I think definitely some guides to what the challenges we're facing going forward. So I think, I don't know how this, I mean, if you want to take yourself off mute, a very quick round of applause for the panelists. So thank you. And I don't know if I'll try that again, but so I'm just imagining everybody's putting away behind the mute. It's fantastic. And the presentations will be published. If you've got any follow-up questions with any of the panelists, I think their contact details will be available there. So please follow up. I think at one final point, if anybody, in terms of setting up a regional chapter for the Groningen Declaration Network, that is still a work in progress for Oceania. And so if anybody is interested in being part of that, please feel free to contact me. My details, I think, will be available on the thing as well. But I'd also be really interested to hear if anybody from other jurisdictions, other areas, other regions of the world is thinking of similar things about sharing any ideas that you might have as well. So again, and in conclusion, thanks to everybody for joining in. And again, thanks very much to the panelists for what I thought was a really interesting discussion. So thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, Stephanie.